Foster here joined. So first off, on behalf of MyZone, I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar on U.S. member journey in the era of COVID-19 by Club Intel. You know, in this time where state and local governments don't appear to be following any science in establishing their reduced occupancy or forced closure edicts, it's critical that our industry produces academic reports to help our leaders make informed decisions going forward. And that's why we're proud to have sponsored this Club Intel report and also the upcoming Europe Active report on COVID transmission after they reviewed data on 115 million visits to health clubs over the last 6 months. As you listen to this presentation, if you'd like more information on MyZone, please feel free to email BD, that's business development, so bd@myzone.org, and a rep will get in contact with you right away. Joining me on this call is longtime friend, Steve Therrett, who is a co-founder and partner in Club Intel, as well as the owner and chief executive officer, as well as president of Club Industry Consulting. Stephen served as a chief executive officer for the Russian Fitness Group for 3 years and had a 20-year career in management with Club Corp. He currently serves on the advisory boards of AFS and Club Industry. He has authored 10 books for the fitness industry, including Fitness Management, 4th edition, and AFS ebook Studio Success. He has an MS in kinesiology from the University of Michigan. And as I hand it over to Stephen, I will say that I've never been so cold in my life as the day I visited you in Moscow, and it was minus 25 degrees.
Well, Mike, thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining the call. And I vividly remember the look on Mike's face when he was in Moscow and it was minus 25. He had a lot of icicles hanging from his face. As a Southern California boy, it was definitely a shock for him. But welcome, everyone. And as Mike said, our talk's called The Member Journey in the Area of COVID-19. It's based on 2 studies. Club Intel initially did a study of 2,000 U.S. members back in the summer of this year. And then we did a follow-up, a recurring study again this past month. And so the data comes from those 2 studies. But I'd like to start with a quote from Hiromu Akawara, which is actually the pen name for a very famous manga artist. And probably many of you don't know what manga is, but it's a form of Japanese graphic novel. And she said, it's a cruel and random world, but the chaos is also beautiful. And I took from this what I think of this year. We are in a very cruel and random world in 2020. COVID-19 has not just turned us upside down and inside out. It's come and it's gone, and we've seen openings and closings and more closing. It's been pretty chaotic. Yet hidden in there, I believe, as does my business partner, Mark, and I know Mike and MyZone and our other sponsor from Vidori Ventures believes there is beauty to be found. And we're hoping this presentation and the study from which it comes will shed light on the beauty that lays within all that randomness and chaos. So a little bit about today's journey. Mike and I are going to intersperse throughout this presentation. We always think 2 voices are better than 1. But I'm going to begin by talking about how the study was conducted. I believe it's imperative that people understand the context of the study as they interpret the results for themselves. Next, we're going to talk about the member story at reopening. What was happening since this study was launched November 9th and closed around November 30th? We're really going to understand what was happening on November 30th or in that period of time. We're then going to talk about the member perceptions of their safety during this time in their facility or out. We're then going to do the longitudinal part, which is to look at that journey from pre-closure, during closure, and at reopening. And then we're going to flip a little bit. We're going to talk about some gender and generational nuances to the data. And I think this is important because gender and generation, much more so than household income or education or region, really told a different story than the general data itself. And then we'll just have a short piece on what does it mean for you as an operator, as a fitness professional. And of course, we'll then have time for Q&A, which Mike will lead. Let's talk a little bit about the study. The initial survey was done in June of this year. We surveyed 2,000 US individuals from 20 major MSAs. MSAs are metropolitan statistical areas. And these represented all 4 of the census regions, as well as what the census calls their divisions, 7 divisions. People were screened in by age, they had to be 18, and they had to be a club member currently, or at the time of that survey had just canceled as a result of COVID-19 closures. And that was 2,000. So it very well represented the demographics of the US, but more importantly, that of a US Health Club member. Then in November, we did what's called a recurring survey. We went back to those same 2,000 people. We wanted to know what their journey's been like. What has happened to them since we first studied them? Have their opinions changed? Have their sentiments changed? Have their behaviors and experiences changed? And again, we left that open 2 weeks. And both studies were done in partnership with a company called Dynata, which is one of the largest international research panels on the globe. And we have used them for other studies as well. So that's the context. So when you see some trend data, it represents a specific audience because that's the goal of a longitudinal study. So let's begin with that member story. Kate Zabriskie said that customers' perceptions is your reality. And I think that's important. Right now, our industry is going through a lot of turmoil. And as an operator, as a fitness professional, we tend to look at that forest from our own perspective. But our success going forward, and even our success today, is highly dependent on understanding that customer's perceptions. So the first thing is that of all these people that we surveyed, 68% of the members said their clubs were opened, but 32% said those clubs remain closed. So if you looked at in a big picture, that means the maximum number of members that could be back in clubs in general would only be 68%. As of the end of November, 32% of our members still couldn't access their club or another club in their market. Now, the question is, okay, did they actually come back? 26% of the members had actually returned to their former facility, be it a club, be it a studio. And most of you are going to say, wow, that's not very much. 4% went to somebody else and 4% went through a digital intermediary. So technically, a third of these members were back in a brick and mortar health and fitness environment. But there are a whole lot that didn't go back. 41% were still waiting, but they were exercising on their own. And we think this is part of what may be a behavioral change, because if your club's been closed 3 months, 6 months, chances are you have picked up and adopted new habits. More alarming was that 20% of people not only had not returned, but they had stopped exercising altogether. And there's been very little research about habit formation, but there was one that said that the average habit takes about 66 days to acquire or to lose. But it could range from a few days up to 180. I think the point we're seeing, especially because this is longitudinal, is that a lot of people may have lost one pattern and adopted a new one. But we asked people, okay, why haven't you returned? And other than the fact that for 32% their club wasn't open, for 57% of the members, they're not confident that the pandemic is under control where they are. When we first did this study way back, we asked 22 questions of people about what would influence the return. One of the top 5 was the COVID virus not being under control. And so because it's not under control, people still are not confident. And that's keeping them from returning. That's something we as operators can't control. But 28% said they're not returning because they're not confident that their facility is properly adhering to safety guidelines. 27% said they're not returning because they're not confident their fellow members, their fellow users are doing the right thing. Those are perceptions. That may not be the reality in your business, but that was the perception of these members. And some of this is uncontrollable. Obviously, the COVID part we can't control. So the vaccine is out there and there's community halt. But these other things are perceptions, and people pick up perceptions in lots of different ways. So it tells you from a messaging perspective, we have work to do. What we did think was also interesting is that 19% of members said their club had permanently closed. I mean, it no longer was around. And you'll see in the data as we go on, is that when people's clubs closed, they didn't necessarily go somewhere else. Their allegiance was with where they were. Maybe it was location based or whatever. And I'd like Mike to chime in on this particular slide because he'd like to add to this.
Yeah, Steve, it's interesting that, member perception is going to play a large role in the recovery. And I think that we all as operators and vendors in this industry need to understand that while perception is reality, that just because the vaccine has been released and is starting to be shot into people's arms, that some members will feel uncomfortable in our facilities for a very long time. And while I do think that there will be a V-shaped or a steeped recovery in sort of mid next year or early second quarter of next year, our battle against that perception is going to be waged sort of member by member. And, as we've gone through this pandemic, no one can fault another person's perception of the pandemic, but the perception of the safety of our club is going to dictate the rate of return of our industry, I believe.
And I agree with you 100%. And I think this brings up a point I was going to share later, but you brought it up, and I think it's important. Is right now, we all have been fighting this battle with governments. Let us open, which is important. We need to be able to conduct business. But the arbiter of our success is not the government. It's the consumer. And no matter what story we tell our governments, what story do we need to tell to those in our community, to our fellow members? Because it's their perceptions that will keep us from being able to prevail or succeed. So on this slide, you see a set of handcuffs, and I refer to as being handcuffed. And one of the things in our first study we asked was about, what happened when doors closed, and probably over 40% of members said their clubs still build them. So we came back and said, okay, now that they've reopened, what did you experience? Well, just over 40% said that once their facility reopened, they were automatically billed. Whether they came back or not, whether they said they wanted to come back, they were automatically billed. Another 22% who were on freeze said, you know what? They're limiting how long I can stay in freeze. They're giving me no choice. I either cancel or I come back. And I refer to that as hostage capitalism. I understand it. It's important. It's a business. We have to have cash flow. But if you look at it from the consumer's perspective, it's like, wait a second. All of a sudden your door's open, you're billing me. Do you not care about how I perceive things, how I feel? And there's 22% that are also. Only 30% said that their clubs were going to wait and bill them when they returned. And I think it's going to see that story a little bit later on. This does impact return and why return may be lower, but also eats away at that foundation of trust that we all need to be successful. This next one is called most members were given an incentive for hanging around. A lot of our members said we're hanging around. By the way, in Europe, more members hung around than members in the US. In Europe, people were able to keep billing and members said, okay, that's not quite the American mindset. But for those who did hang around, their club was closed 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, some in New York, 6 months. 40% of members said when the club did reopen, they extended their contract to a period equal to what they had missed. So basically speaking, if I had a 1-year membership, I'd only use 4, but I missed 4, I got another 4. This is great. 18% said when they asked for a repayment, they got it. And 11% said they were given in-store credit. So almost 70% got something in return. They got an incentive. Only 31% didn't get an incentive. And even though it says other in the text words, it was, I got nothing. But to say 70% rewarded you, so to speak, for hanging around is a positive sign for the industry. It builds trust. Then there's VOD, and VOD stands for video on demand. It's a common term used outside our industry for library on demand content or streaming content. And 58% of the members said when they returned to their facility, that club, that studio, was offering some form of digital VOD. If we were to go back a couple of years, and our company does an annual industry trend study, except for this year because of COVID, maybe 10, 15% of clubs offered it. So I think one of the things that you find interesting is that the clubs have embraced VOD as a new part of their value equation. That's the change. And the other graph basically will tell you that 44% of members who returned are actually using it. And I want to put that at 44% who returned are using your VOD. Think about this, that about 12% are using personal training. About 12% are using small group training. This tells you from either a value add or monetization perspective that video on demand is something members like, know you have, and will use. And so I'd like Mike to step in and talk a little bit more about that VOD from the perspective of MyZone.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. We recognize that connecting with your members who are not at the club is a critical component of the omni-channel or multi-channel approach going forwards for clubs. And this is why we created MZ Remote, our live stream platform that allows video streaming of the instructor together with the motivational heart rate display to give that member a feeling of live instruction, but then also give the member a feeling of being part of that community while they're taking the class. We believe that it's much more sticky to have a member have bi-directional feedback. So we not only prescribe exercise, but we can prescribe intensity. And that would allow that member to feel like they're part of the class, get better and more personalized instruction, but then also give them the motivation to continue to exercise at home.
Thank you, Mike. And again, that's an example of the VOD. So let's talk a little bit about member attitudes and perceptions around safety. And I share a quote from Andy Warhol. He's not a great philosopher. You can debate whether he's a great artist. I guess it depends on the type of art you like. But he did have a great quote, said, perception precedes reality. And I like that because the reality is, and I hate to double play on words, is that people perceive something. And over time, that becomes their actual reality. And so as we look at these member perceptions of safety, from your perspective as an operator, they may not be reality. But as you understand the members' perceptions, that has to become your reality. So one of the things we asked every member was, okay, you're back. We gave them a statement. Has your facility addressed your concerns with respect to providing a reasonably safe environment from COVID-19? And 70% of members agreed with that. 32% strongly, 38% agreed. So 7 out of 10 people who returned could say, you know what? I agree with the fact my facility is doing what it can to provide me with a reasonably safe environment. That's good news for the industry. There's 23% that are just sort of like, I'm not really sure. Those are members we may have to worry about canceling. And there's 8% that just don't think you're doing it. But almost in all surveys, you're going to find 5 to 10% of people will always disagree. I don't think we ever find it much different than that. Now, one of the things we did in our first survey is we asked about 22 things, both that a club could do and that the community can do to influence their ability to return. These are all safety things. Of those 22, 12 were determined to be statistically significant. In other words, they were highly, extremely influential to these members in terms of impacting the return. 2 of them were community-based around COVID. So we looked at the 10 that an operator could impact, and that's what we're going to show you. And you're going to look about staff wearing face masks. 3 out of 4 members who returned are like, hey, we agree or strongly agree that our club is making sure that staff wear masks. 67%, 2/3 are saying, hey, other members are wearing protective face masks. And as you'll see later on when we show you trend data, these all align with what members said was important. We're right on track. What surprised us a little bit was this one about protective gloves. It's only 55% could say they agree or strongly agree. And I guess you'll have to know your own club. Again, remember, this is one of the 10 most important things to members. So if you're out there and you're one of the 75, 70, or 55, great. If you're one of those in the 9 and 8 or 9 and 4 on these that disagrees, it's an opportunity for you to step it up. The next area was around physical distancing. I know we all hear the term social distancing, but in our surveys, we like to use the word physical distancing. And there were 3 things that the members said back in the summer were extremely important in influencing their decision to return. And as you can see on this, whether it's visible communication on distancing, limiting the number of people in a class or training, or limiting the total number of people in a facility, anywhere from 70 to 75% of those who return said, I agree or strongly agree that my facility is addressing it. And I think from an industry perspective, that's a good story to share. Obviously, we'd like to have 100%. Probably in reality, you never get above 95%. So there's still an opportunity for the industry if those who aren't falling into this high water mark are not there yet. But there were some things that the members said they were not as confident, they couldn't agree or strongly agree with. One of those was observing their facility conducting daily temperature screenings of either staff or members. You know, that's under 60%, that's 56%. And there's, 22% said they don't see it happening. And we understand that some of these things are not mandated by any state or government. So if it's not mandated by a state or government, why should I do it? Here's the reason. Because for the member, it is important. Again, to open, you got to meet the government guidelines. But to be successful, to thrive, you got to meet the expectations of your members. This other one is management is transparent about communicating if any staff or member has tested positive. Only 56% of members agreed or strongly agree that their clubs are doing that. And you make your, why is that? Why does that perception exist? That's not a good perception because that breaks down trust. And you're going to see some data pretty soon that says maybe that is why. So half of members feel management is not holding members accountable. So on this page are 2 things that are also under 60%, but particularly one of them. Management confronts and then removes members who fail to adhere to safety policies. That's 50% would agree. 36% don't know what to do. So just like temperature screening, just like being open and communicating if someone's tested positive, members also aren't highly in agreement with the fact that they see their management willing to confront someone who isn't willing to adhere. There was just a story the other day about United Airlines kicking a family off the plane because a 2-year-old wouldn't wear a face mask. Agree or disagree, they had a policy and the staff held the member accountable. What this is saying is that if you have policies in place, they don't always feel the staff or management are holding others to the gun. Now, this is a perception, but if they don't feel that you're doing that, how does that influence their decision to return? And Mike, I know you'd like to add something to this.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because one of the many gyms I'm a member of has a very large sign out front that says masks required, but they don't enforce the mask mandate in the workout area. And so I think they have a certain segment of the membership population is comfortable with not wearing masks and comfortable with working out with members not wearing masks. But I think the majority of the population of that club is staying at home or maybe had visited once to see that other members weren't wearing masks and then went home and aren't going back until either there's a vaccine in place and it's widely spread out throughout the population, or the club complies with the mask mandate here in Orange County, California. But I think this whole perception of requiring members to clean up after themselves, which is always good hygiene for our properties, the perception of that happening or not happening is going to be something that's going to inhibit our full return back to full occupancy. And it's almost like saying to a restaurant, customer, you're going to have to clean your table and do the dishes after your meal. But the reality of it is that there's no way that we could ever employ enough staff to clean after everyone using a leg press, leg extension, a piece of weight equipment, cardio maybe. But so it's going to be incumbent upon the member to clean up after themselves. And that's one of the hurdles that we're going to need to overcome to get back to full recovery.
Mike, thank you. And I'd like to reinforce how important it is from a member perception perspective that if you have rules and policies, you follow them. We're sort of living in a world now that's, unfortunately, especially in the US maybe, it's divided in many cases by ideology. A mask is an infringement on my lifestyle. And it's okay to feel that way. But at the same time, as a business operator, you have a tough decision making. If you have a policy that says masks are required, you got to hold people accountable to that. Once you don't hold someone accountable, you're breaking a bond of trust. And in today's world, whether it's with a Yelp, a TripAdvisor, your social media page, Reddit, you name it, it gets out there and you cannot necessarily control it. On this slide, one of the questions we asked people was, have you heard of, are you aware of anybody, member or staff, having tested positive for COVID? 18%, 1 out of 5 members said, yes, we've heard of it. That was much higher than we expected because we have all this data that shows the rate of transmission is like 0.00001 or 2. It's hardly there. It's non-existent. Yet the perception of the members are 1 out of 5, someone's tested positive. And then we asked them just in a range, how many? Well, 57% of these members said that was between 1 and 5. Another 23% said it was 5 and 10. Collectively, 82% said more than one person in their facility had tested positive. They were aware of it. The question is, how were they aware of it? Because we saw earlier, they don't trust that management is being open about this, which sort of lends us at Club Intel to believe that they're hearing it through social media or the old-fashioned word of mouth by text or a messaging service. This next one is, we put this question in just before we launched, because other organizations, like in the restaurant and hospitality industry, have done things around this, is would a seal of safety, a like COVID-19 safety seal, certification, designation, influence your decision to return? This went out to all members, even the ones that didn't return. Well, 35% said, you know what, this would be highly influential. It could impact me. If I saw on your website, on your door or wherever that you had been like certified to be COVID-19 safe, it would highly influential. 42% said somewhat influential. But then we asked, okay, if it is somewhat or even highly influential, where should it come from? Overwhelmingly, by a large margin, members were most confident, completely confident in a professional scientific medical organization, such as American Medical, American Heart, American College of Sportsmen. If it came from someone like that, 76% would be somewhat or completely, but 32% were completely confident. That's huge. Trailing behind that was like a World Health or CDC or local health department. So having a seal is one thing, where it comes from, the member's perception. And I think what's important here is, as an industry, we have to be careful about how much people may or may not trust us, but they do trust professional scientific organizations. And so we wanted to bring that forward. What I'd like to do next is take that journey with you, before closure, during closure, and after reopening. And I have a favorite quote of mine from Maya Angelou. She said, I have learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that story was told in our first survey. That's about the emotional context, how people feel. Perceptions are driven not upon what I see, not necessarily upon what I touch, not necessarily about what I hear, but about what I feel. And so as you look at this journey, as we go through this, keep that in consideration. So the first thing is, we want to know, now that you've returned, are you doing anything different than you did before the club actually closed? And on the one side of this slide, we show that, whether it's group X, small group, personal training, the level of participation has dropped off marginally. Statistically, it's pretty much the same as it was before the clubs closed. We do see a 5-point uptick in the number of people doing things on their own. I think this corresponds with the fact that those clubs that are open, you're having to provide capacity limits in a classroom or capacity limits in a club. If you're doing personal training, the trainer's got to be 6 feet away. So all these numbers make sense. What we thought was more interesting and is very telling is how active people were. In IHRSA's data, they talk about a core member. That's someone that's 100 visits a year or more. So that's 8 or more visits. Last year, we talked about what's called an active member. That's 150 times a year, 12 times a month. What we found is the percent of members who were active increased from 32 to 38%. There's a considerable jump there, while there was almost equal drop in the percentage of people that worked out 8 to 12 times. I believe people who were core bumped up. It almost is telling us that our most loyal, most enthusiastic, some of you like to call gym rats. I hate to use that because they're really our loyal, fanatical, enthusiastic members. They were waiting, they were ready to jump in, and they did. They're more active. Those who did 4 to 8 times, pretty statistically the same, and those infrequent users actually bumped up. So I think the story that we saw with all of this, and this sort of reinforces it, is that a lot of you got your most active people back right away. So what I'd like to do is share this graph, because this has to do with usage, but not so much what we're showing just in the club, because my zone tracks this. So Mike, I'd like you to share a little bit of what's on here.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And before I go over this slide, I just wanted to mention that we are recording this seminar, and we will give you a link to re-review this webinar. And also feel free to add any questions either to the Q&A section or to the comments, and Steve has agreed to answer a few questions after the formal presentation. But what this slide shows is that where members are working out. And as you can appreciate, we track a lot of statistics on our MyZone Belt users. And pre-pandemic, our users were exercising 60% inside the club in February of 2020, compared to 40% outside the club. And as you can imagine, in April 2020, when all of the clubs around the world, or the majority of the clubs around the world, were forced to close, only 3% of the workouts were done inside a gym. And I'm not sure who they were. Maybe they were the gym owners actually going in and unlocking their gym and doing a workout, but it was a very small percentage. But it was interesting to note that although it was 97% of the workouts were done outside the gym, only 30% of our users, compared to February, stopped exercising. So 70% of our members were still exercising. They just found another place to work out. They were working out in their homes based on virtual streaming, or they were working out outside. Now, while this has recovered, it's only recovered to 38% working out inside the gym in November 2020 and 62% working out outside the gym. And this just highlights the importance of connecting with your member outside the four walls of the physical plant.
Mike, thank you. Not only does it emphasize how important it is to connect with them outside, but it tells you, because this aligns with our data, about 34% of people going back to a facility, that people haven't embraced the brick and mortar experience yet, except for the most enthusiastic. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about that feeling that Maya Aguilar referred to. One of the things we did at Club and Tell for the before, during, and after was measure those feelings of the experience. Many of you probably measure MPS, whether you use TRP, MXM, Listen 360, there's others out there. I think probably in the US, MXM is the biggest. But you're measuring someone's likelihood to refer, which is one of 4 measures that consumer researchers use to measure people's sentiments about their experience, about their level of loyalty and their level of love. There's also measuring delight. There's measuring likelihood to remain, likelihood to refer. And a lot of companies like us also use how much do I love my club. One of the things we measured all the way through this experience was delight. We give them a statement. I am delighted with my experience, and they can go from not agreeing to strongly agreeing. So the top box is strongly agree. The top 2 boxes, I either agree or I strongly agree. Before closure, we had a top box of 30%. It dropped by 50% during closure, and then it bumped up to 25 at reopening. And you can sort of see the same trend with the top 2, 75, 44, 66. It tells us a couple things. The favorable things, it says that experience, that feeling of delight, that loyalty is almost back to where it was before closure. It's not quite back there. 5 and 7 and 8 points is still a significant difference, but it's working its way back from that low point during closure. So it does tell us that physical relationship, that inside the brick and mortar, is important to delight. And we also found it's important to refer and to recommend. It's important to all those things. So we did want to bring that forward. But we also want to point out it's been the most loyal members that have come back, which could influence. Okay. Now, what we wanted to show you, which we thought was really important, during our first study, we actually asked members, your club is closed, your studio is closed. How likely are you to return when the door is open? Well, 65% of them said I'm either fairly or very likely to return. 37% said, you know what, I'm very likely to return. I'm there. And only 26% actually returned. So what people perceived they would do doesn't align with what they actually did. It does align somewhat with their high sentiment of very likely. It's still a little bit off, but it's close. And we think that has a lot to do with how circumstances changed, how that randomness of 2021 or 2020 went on. Was hope 2021 is not as random and cruel. But we also looked about what they said about returning to somebody else. And 21% said, hey, I'm very, very likely to abandon and go somewhere else. 9% said I'm very likely to abandon, and 8% actually did. So when it comes going somewhere else, if someone said I'm very likely to go, it looks like we could believe them because that's what they did. When they said they are very likely to return, we pretty much can believe them, but other variables seem to have influenced that. Next, what we did find was interesting that members returned a lot faster than they said they would. I guess that's good news. When we asked people, 34% said they were fairly or very likely to come back that first week. A third, 44% actually came back that first week. That's pretty amazing. I mean, that's very high. That far exceeds what we expected. And that, again, probably speaks to that most loyal, enthusiastic member. They didn't care. If you didn't have masks, they came back. If you weren't cleaning, they probably still came back. They missed you dearly, and they wanted to be back. The percent of people who said they would come back between weeks 1 and 4 was 34%, and 33% actually did. So statistically, there's no difference. So those who are going to wait 1 to 4 weeks, it's pretty much a perfect alignment. And then for 1 month to 3 months, 25% said yeah, 18% actually did, but you can basically see the flip between that and the first week. So there was a lot of desire among a small group of members, 44% of 26% that said, I'm in there. You know, a lot of empirical data is out there that says, you know, I saw 40% of my members the first week. It aligns with this because what you were seeing was the people you always see. For those of you who track data in our industry, by and large, in any given day, 20% of members come in the club. Any given month, 60% come in, 40% don't. So you're only seeing the most active, and this sort of aligns with that. This one, again, we shared it earlier, but we think it's important to show during closure to after. During closure, only 27% of their members indicated that their studio, their club, was offering digital content, yet upon return, 58% said it. So during that closure period, a lot of operators ramped up VOD. The question is, are you monetizing it or just using it as a value add? And I think you'll see that answer a little later. Now, go back to those people that didn't come back, to those 41% who said, I haven't come back yet, but I am exercising. So what are they exercising at? We compared it to closure to now. During closure, 68% said I walked, I biked, I jogged. 65% are still doing it. Really no significant change. 59% say I'm working at home, following my own program. 49% now. There is some statistical difference there. We can't explain that. What we thought was interesting is among those who didn't come back was the drop-off in the use of VOD, video and time. 30% of members were using your club's, your studio's content during closure. Now only 7% are. 24% were using third-party, Peloton, Daily Burn, Gaiam. There's a lot of them out there. Today, 13% are. And I say, well, why would that drop off? We think there's a couple reasons. First of all, if 30% of your members were using it during closure and only 7% now, and these are people that are not coming in, they may be on freeze. Why aren't they using it now? We think a lot of clubs gave it away for free during closure, but now that they're open, they're monetizing. And all of a sudden, these people don't want to use it. Or some clubs may not have actually incorporated it once they reopen. And the same thing goes for the third party. A lot of third party providers such as Peloton gave subscriptions away for free, iFit and others. So maybe it wasn't long enough for people to fully embrace the dollar value that is associated with VOD. But Mike, I'd like you to add to this.
Yeah, Stephen, I think there's a few issues I'd like to raise is one, the member perception of VOD and the member perception of video on demand that's not highly personalized and not gamified, and the retention or attrition rate associated with those types of mobile applications. I think it's critical to make sure that you have a personalization of your prescription for exercise, in the sense that you can actually not only be barking out exercises to the client, but you can give them a bidirectional feedback marker to say, this exercise should yield this intensity, for instance. You're doing the burpees correctly and with the correct intensity if it yields a yellow tile. That integrates a higher level of personalization. But then also gamification. Gamification, our studies show that if a member is involved in a challenge, they will exercise 80% more than the period before they were in a challenge. And so personalization and gamification are really important to rid of any type of technology. But the last thing I would say about this slide is, there's a term that a New York University professor came up with a short while ago called the rundle. And what the rundle is the recurring revenue bundle. And I think our gyms are going to have to figure out how they increase yield per member. And part of that solution is going to be through this omni-channel approach to delivering content to membership. Gone are the days that we can just rely on membership and PT to drive our revenue. And I think the club of the future is going to have this rundle theory of membership that bundles in membership, maybe some instruction, but also whatever digital platform that they adopt for their membership. And they're going to charge for it, and it's going to increase their yield per member.
No, I think that's a great insight. I'm going to add a non-fitness industry insight. I'm part owner of a video game company called Dinosaur Games. And over the last 7 months, digital content for gaming has seen all-time records every single month. But what's interesting, most of that revenue comes from monetization, what's called free to play with a monetization strategy. And one of the things in the gaming industry, everybody measures, especially mobile gaming, but also a lot of the platforms that use monetization approaches on free to play, is they measure conversion. How many players and how quickly can they convert a player to monetize? And I think, as Mike said, that is part of the future. So I think digital may be the new form of small group and personal training. So last point before we get to some other interesting data on gender and generation is, remember we talked about earlier that there were 10 things that members said were really, really important to them, extremely important to influencing the return. So we took those and show the percent, which is I'm colorblind, so I'm going to say the darker orange and or the red is what people said was very to extremely important to drive the return. And then the lighter form, the lighter shade, I'm into giving you shades because of color blindness, is what people said they agree or strongly agree their clubs are doing. And if you look across the board here, whether it's contactless entry, staff and members in masks, limiting number of people, group X, visible communication, all those things, members were from 60 to 70% saying this was important, and the clubs were hitting it on the nail, right on the head, which is telling us what members perceived as important. In a general sense, players in the industry have met it, and in some cases exceeded it. Here's 5 of the other ones that were very important. You can see in terms of importance, 69 to 76% level of importance. Again, we hit it on the head except for 2 things. The transparency of communicating if someone has tested positive, which is negative 19. We fell well below that, and disinfecting equipment after each use. Now, as Mike said, we may not be able to, we don't have the staff to do it, but someone must have set that expectations, because that's what the members expected, and they don't think they're getting it. But it's this transparency of communication that I think could be a hurdle, not just now, but going forward. So what I'd like to do now with Mike is sort of talk about gender and generational nuances. And I share a quote from John Gray, who wrote the book Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, which has got to be at least 20, 25 years old. And for some people listening here, they may not even been born when this book was right. But he said, not only do men and women communicate differently, but they think, they feel, they perceive, they react, respond, love, need, and appreciate differently. And for many of you that are in a relationship, you probably can equate to that. But I think it is also applicable to generations. I think generations communicate differently. I think they think differently, perceive and respond and appreciate a little bit differently. You know, I have kids who are, one's a millennial and one's like between millennial and Xer. And they're not, they'll call me on the phone, but they're all into texting or using Discord or a messaging service. And then we have 2, what we call our adopted grandkids. They're not ours, but we've been watching them for the last 10 years since they were 2 and 4. And they love to communicate with us by text and by emojis. And so I guess my point is, what John Gray said about men and women is probably as applicable in many cases to generations. And so it's important to understand some of those nuances, because those are the perceptions of your members. So the first thing is that women were much more likely to cancel than men, and millennials and Gen Z were more likely to cancel than boomers and Xers. And I say, okay, so why is that important? Well, think about it. Population-wise, the largest population in our country is actually Generation Z. They just kicked millennials out of first place. In the club industry, though, the largest segment is millennials. Boomers, old timers like me, my kids might use a different term for it, we're slowly fading away. And COVID has sort of expedited that process for some of us. But the point being is that and women represent a little larger percentage of members. So if women are less likely to join, 4 points less, if my value proposition depends on women, I should be concerned. What do I need to do to get those women to come back at the rate men are? Same thing, Gen Z, 27% canceled. 30% of millennials, and only 16% of boomers. You'll see some of those reasons as we go forward, but the point we want to make to you is that in most cases, it's been the boomers and the Xers that have been the first ones in the doors. Millennials and Zs aren't coming in as fast, and neither are women. And along those lines, women were less likely to come back to their former facility, and millennials were also the least likely to return. So think about it. Women were more likely to cancel by 4 points, and they were 6 points less likely to return. 23% of women compared to 29% of men. I would also note that more women dropped out of fitness altogether, or joined another facility, or went to a digital middleman. So women didn't go back to their former facility nearly as much as men. I don't know if it's loyalty or what, but they did go somewhere else. When you add it up, it comes out pretty close to the same. As far as the generations, if you look at this, Generation Z, 23% have not returned, nor are they pursuing a fitness program. It's more than the other generations. For millennials, they haven't returned, but they are working out on their own. So there's a little nuance. Women less likely to return to their former club, more likely to have canceled, more likely to have gone somewhere else. Gen Z and millennials, more likely to have canceled, more likely to not return. Maybe the biggie here is that women are less confident across the board with respect to safety, compliance, and the virus. Well, those sentiments really vary by generations, nothing significant. But it didn't matter. Confident that their fellow members will do the right thing, 30% of women aren't, 26% of men. Not confident their facility will do the right thing, 30% women, 25%. And same thing with just the pandemic under control. This is important. Women are less confident about the community. They're less confident about you. They're less confident about their fellow members. So if you want them back, what do you have to do? You have to help them gain confidence. That's a story that you tell. But think about this. This may have been the story you told before you closed. Dr. Seuss said something very important. I'm a Dr. Seuss fan, one of the greatest philosophers in the history of mankind. He said, you never know the value of a moment till it becomes a memory. What were the memories of women before your doors closed? And has that happened to influence their perceptions and their level of confidence? From our earlier survey, I would say yes, because women held clubs and operators to a higher bar then. In terms of generational, it makes sense. Baby boomers were the least confident that the pandemic would be under control. I mean, they were a little bit more scared. That makes sense. And more Gen Z saw their permanent facility closed. 20% of them couldn't go back to their original facility. Otherwise, not a lot of differences by generation. It was that gender thing that we thought was surprising. As far as those who didn't return, we compared them. But basically what you have to know is that if they didn't return, baby boomers are even more active than before doing their thing outside. Walk in the neighborhood, jog in the neighborhood, bike in the neighborhood. Millennials and Gen Z, they're more likely to be hooked on digital content, VOD. You can see that 27, 25 respectively are using a third party, and 13, 11% are using something from their former facility. So then you can monetize these younger generations. But Mike has some interesting insight to add here as well.
Yes, Steve, since 2011 and we launched the MyZone platform, we've been preaching about the importance of connecting with your member inside and outside the club in order to develop a more relevant relationship. It's not just enough to have that connection the 1 or 2 times a week that the member decides to visit your club. And in 2020, I think that it's critical that clubs expand their reach outside the 4 walls of their physical plant. And the goal, I think, of every club today is to create that feeling that they're the physical activity hub of the community. Let's leave behind this old theory of the gym, and let's really develop that critical message to our members that we are the physical activity hub of the community, and that will allow us to succeed going forward.
Oh, I appreciate it. I think that's really important. Robert Debman and I spent 20 years with Club Corp. And for a long time, I actually reported to the gentleman. And one of the things he always talked about with us is that we were truly a home away from home. And I think in this day and age, he would say, we're a home away from home. We're a home within the home. And I think I would like to add that to Mike's comment. So one of the things, when they did go back among the members, the women definitely were more likely than the men to go toward Group X and personal training. And men, as we all know, more likely to do their own thing, which has been a practice of men for a long time in the club industry. But women were 5 times as likely as men to have gone back to group exercise, even if they had to stand 10 feet apart. Matter of fact, I think a lot of women liked it because there was less people in the class. 3 times as many women went back to personal training, even though they got to stand 6 feet or 10 feet away than men. But men were free for all. Let's do our own thing. And I think this is important for 2 reasons. One is for these internal services, you're going to have more success monetizing women, but you get less women back. So if you want to monetize them, you got to get them back. You got to make them feel more confident, feel safer in your experience. As far as VOD, and I think this makes sense, women were much more aware of their facility offering it than men were. There's a quote that nobody knows who to attribute it to. It said, men never remember, women never forget. Well, the men were less aware that VOD existed than women, which means that's an audience to market to. Then look at it by generation. The Gen Z were all over it. They knew it was there. The other generations, with the exception of boomers, pretty equal in their awareness. But who was most active using it? Women. 57% of women were using a club's VOD, only 31% of men, almost double. Again, women value that. And I will tell you, there were more women among Gen Z and millennials. But the point is that women are using it. And look at it, 20% use it maybe once a week, 25% up to twice a week. And then there's 13% that are using it more than twice a week. It's a true value add. It's a true monetization opportunity for women. Among the generations, the same thing can be said about Generation Z and about millennials. They're the active users. They're the ones using it. So again, bring home that point. We're seeing a shift, a paradigm shift. Is digital is not only taking hold outside, digital is taking hold inside for certain populations. And since those are important populations, we have to be aware as operators. When it comes to addressing safety concerns, pretty even. Gen Z and millennials were a little less likely, particularly Generation Z, to say operators were adequately addressing their safety concerns. But overall, it's pretty similar. Not enough to make a big story about. But this is the one we thought was important, was that 24% of women were aware of a positive test, only 12% of men. Go back to my earlier quote about men and women. And then look at 47% of Gen Z, 30% of millennials, and then it takes a real drop after that. Why are the younger generations and the women hearing a positive test? Why are members not overly confident that we're sharing that information? We can only guess. We didn't ask them where they found it. That would have been a little too intrusive. We believe it's social media. We believe it's word of mouth. If you're active out there in the broadband and the internet, you're going to hear things that clubs may not be sharing, or members may not be sharing with their club, but they're sharing with their friends and their associates. Just want to be, because when people hear this, what does that do? That makes them less confident, makes them concerned, more hesitant to come back. So what I'd like to do is, before we get to Q&A, is just finish up with a one-pager on what this may mean for all of you. And I share a quote from W. Edward Deming, a great engineer, business professional, well-known. He said, change is actually optional because survival isn't mandatory. And I bring that forward. And that refers to us as humans, but also as business. Survival for a business isn't mandatory. Survival for an industry isn't mandatory. And we as operators have to put that hat on. Our survival isn't mandatory. We care. But unless you're really willing to change, if change is mandatory, survival is more likely to be mandatory. So we hope you take some of this to heart. So the first thing we want to bring forward is that automatic billing at reopening, limited freeze periods, not canceling memberships, all had an impact on the low return rates. We saw during the first study the negative perceptions around clubs who just did not stop billing, just kept on billing during closure, or made it a frigging nightmare to cancel. Then here our members are telling us, hey, they just automatically billed us. They wouldn't let us freeze as long. All those things break down trust. And in the future, I don't think we can afford to have that. And we actually, in our report, you'll see it, we know who the clubs are that these members belong to, but we don't share that here in the report. We don't segment by that to be fair to all businesses, but be aware of that. The second thing is the days have passed where your business could depend on non-users or low users propping up the business are slowly fading away. As many of you probably know, there are a lot of business models out there where 50, 40, 60% of their members never come in the door, but they keep paying. You put them on a contract, maybe it's $10, $15, $20 a month, maybe it's as high as 30. They keep paying, but they don't come in. That's where your profit is. But what we're seeing in the data is only the enthusiasts, the active, the core people came back. The non-core people canceled, or they're not back, they will sit on freeze, and they may or may not come back. And we believe that in time, that business model of I'm going to live on people not showing up is going to become a difficult value proposition to live with. Next is members of Gen Z and Gen Y, along with women, are less likely to return to their former facility if they come back at all. And what we really want you to know is that you've got a little tougher battle with women and younger generations. I think that's going to require with women gaining their trust, showing them you're safe, showing the market is safe, telling the right story, and maybe not going back to whatever you did earlier. For younger generations, it's building trust and making sure you have a really robust digital platform. 4 is until COVID is really under control, returning to any sense of normalcy will be slow and it will be painful. The other operators out there that are up to 90%, and we congratulate them. In Japan, there's quite a few that are back to 100%. In the US, there's not a whole lot that are back up there, and they're probably dropping off again. Understand the fact that with women coming back slower, the younger generations coming back slower, you're not going to get back to 2019 this year, and you may not get back to it next year. So you have to build a value proposition. You have to build a business plan that allows you to thrive with fewer members. As Mike said earlier, find a way to monetize the digital. And lastly, going forward, transparency and trust will now become and have become this currency of success. Those who speak about the experience economy have said over the last 2 years, we've seen trust become a more vital part of every business's value proposition. People will buy from those who they trust. People will return. So the question becomes, how much do your former members trust you? We've seen here there are certain things they trust you a lot at. There's certain things they're ambiguous about, and there's certain things they don't trust as much. And we think going forward, as you build your value proposition, you're going to have to work on that. So with that, I would like to say first and foremost, thank you to everybody who sat through our presentation. I know it was a long one, but hopefully a valuable, impactful one. I'd like to thank Mike for being my co-presenter. I thought we worked really well. And also thank MyZone for helping sponsor this presentation and report. And though not presenting Verde Ventures, Brian O'Rourke for helping sponsor the study. I'd like to leave it open for the Q&A, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Mike can gather your questions. And thank you very much.
Okay, yes. Thanks, Steve. That was fantastic. And a lot of really good, valuable information there. We do have a few questions coming in, both the chat and the Q&A, and I apologize, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But first off, what do you see as the top factor in members returning to clubs?
I think there's a couple things. The biggest is there's this core group, and I'm going to call them a core active group of enthusiasts, who exercise is their lifestyle. And it's not just exercise as a lifestyle. They need what you provide, which is this environment where there's people around, whether it's direct contact. They need the inspiration that comes from working out with other people. There are people that just cannot work out on their own. So I think that inspiration is a big factor in driving these people back to a club. Question is, how do you get all those other people to be inspired to come back? But I think that's the big point. And I think it's the other ones, they were in fear of losing their routine, especially if they couldn't get back into that inspirational environment. That's my perspective.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's also critical to really focus on messaging, and to the extent that you can personalize messaging. What was interesting in this report was the attitudes to fitness and attitudes returning just between the age groups, the genders. And so maybe we, for the time being, abandon the one-size-fits-all approach to our club's messaging about cleanliness, about the policies, the new policies that we have in place, and really go to hyper-personalized messaging. I'm not suggesting that we have one email to one person. That would be really difficult to do in larger clubs, but segmenting your membership base into psychographic profiles and having specific messaging to those profiles. Okay, second question is, do you have any data on the effects to overall retention for users that have exercised with VOD or digital?
No, what we did measure is how frequently those who returned to club, we measured how often they were working out in the club to how often they were working out with the digital content. And for those working out more than 12, there weren't as many people working out 12 times VOD as in the club, or 8 to 12. But that 4 to 8 and even 8 to 12, there was a pretty close relationship. What we saw, particularly for women and younger generations, is that they probably work out 2 times a week in the club, and they probably work out 2 times a week on digital content. So that's that 4 to 8 was a really big segment, and the 8 to 12 was the second biggest segment for the digital, whereas for the in-club, it was the 8 to 12 and the 12 and above. So you're seeing this sharing of where they're having their experience, particularly for women and particularly for the younger generations. I don't have any other specific things in terms of retention and canceling, so I do apologize for that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We do have a little bit of data that we were able to compile in conjunction with Blair over at MXN, and we layered our shared customers that he has at MXN and we have at MyZone. And what we noticed is that, number one, a member who has a MyZone belt and is engaged in a digital platform at the club has an 11-point higher NPS score than a member who wasn't on the MyZone digital platform. The other thing that we track is the attitude to exercise for social connections. And what digital allows you to do is maintain that social connection with the member. And what we noticed is if a member receives 4 or more likes in a month, they will work out 40% more. If a member receives 4 or more comments on their workout, congratulations, Steve, you've done a great job, you're getting towards your goal, they will work out 112% more. So just a few little statistics that we have compiled together with MXN, but also our internal platform really shows the power of digital. And not that we have the retention engagement numbers, but those are things that lead to retention and engagement, I would say. Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. And Scott Gillespie from Seiko Sports asks, has there been enough data in the last month or so to see if there's been any notable change in usage, sales, and cancellations as the second wave gains speed and media attention?
So our study was of members, and it's a longitudinal study of members, which means we can actually chart how their behavior and attitudes changed over time. What we didn't do is do a facility study. We did one of those back in May, and we did another one back in September, and chances are we'll probably do one toward the beginning of next year. And then we could do that. So we don't have data from the clubs in that perspective. Our data really pertains to the members. And what the story would tell us is that a lot of people just didn't come back in that first wave because you closed. I think in states like Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, which sort of didn't close for very long to begin with and really haven't stepped back, you're seeing higher levels than you are through other parts of the country. So we don't have facts about the operator's success. We only have that from May and again from September or October. And obviously, if we did a third study in February, we'd probably see quite a different story. So Scott, I apologize on that. We don't have anything for you on that.
Okay, well, hey, Stephen, this was great. I'd like to thank you all for joining, and most off for Stephen for developing this report. You know, it was super insightful and it was a great presentation. And once again, if you'd like more information on MyZone, feel free to email bd@myzone.org and a rep will get in contact with you right away.
And
Thanks
Mike,
again,
I'd like to add one thing. The report will be available on our website starting late tonight, first thing tomorrow morning.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you everyone for joining.
And Mike, thank you, and thank you everybody. Bye.
Happy holidays.